John Harris thought his life was perfect until the day his brother Ben revealed the unthinkable. A secret affair with his wife Sarah and a devastating diagnosis that would forever change their family. What started as a simple betrayal quickly spiraled into a nightmare, exposing a web of lies, hidden truths, and a dangerous silence that no one could escape. In the end, the real shock wasn't just the affair. It was the life-altering consequences that no one saw coming. In a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside of Seattle, the Harris family was well-known and well-liked. John Harris, a successful attorney with a reputation for being honest and dependable, lived in a beautiful two-story home with his wife Sarah and their 2 children. To outsiders, they seemed like the picture-perfect family, attending community events, hosting backyard barbecues, and always presenting a united front. Neighbors often commented on how lucky they were to have such a stable, loving household right next door. There was laughter in their home, the lights were always warm, and holiday decorations went up like clockwork every year. But as with many stories, what appeared perfect on the outside hid something far more complicated behind closed doors. John was a man of routine. He worked long hours at a downtown law firm but always made time to help with homework or tuck the kids into bed. Sarah, who had once been a school teacher, had taken time off to raise their children and manage the home. She was calm, patient, and always seemed to know how to handle any situation. Together, they made a solid team, or so it appeared. Few people knew that Sarah had been struggling emotionally for some time. The pressures of domestic life, combined with a creeping sense of isolation, had started to take their toll. She didn't talk about it, not even with John, who was so focused on providing for his family that he often missed the signs. Enter Ben Harris, John's younger brother. He had always been more spontaneous, the kind of person who didn't quite follow the same path as his older sibling. He bounced from job to job and had just gone through a difficult breakup that left him without a place to stay. Wanting to help, John offered Ben a room in their home. It was meant to be temporary, just until Ben got back on his feet. At first it seemed harmless. The kids adored their uncle, and Sarah welcomed the company. Ben had a way of making people laugh, of bringing energy into a room. His presence was refreshing, especially for Sarah, who had been feeling invisible in her own home. What no one could have guessed was that this seemingly kind gesture, offering a brother a place to stay, would, open a door to a series of events that would eventually tear the family apart. The house remained beautiful, the smiles stayed in place, but something dark had started to grow within the walls. Ben's arrival brought a new energy to the Harris household. At first, it felt like a change for the better. He helped out around the house, cooked dinner occasionally, and played with the kids in the backyard. The laughter returned to the rooms where things had been growing cold. Sarah found herself smiling more often, something she hadn't done in months. She had grown, accustomed to the monotony of daily life, managing chores, caring for the children, and waiting for John to come home late from work. Ben, however, was present in a way John hadn't been for a long time. He noticed things. When she got a haircut, when she seemed tired, when she looked like she needed someone to talk to. Ben picked up on it all, and he listened. It started with long conversations in the kitchen after the kids went to bed. Ben would pour a glass of wine, and they would talk about anything and everything, her teaching days, his wild stories, the frustration she felt but never voiced. There was no pressure, no expectations, just 2 people talking, laughing, and sharing pieces of themselves they had kept hidden. Sarah began to look forward to those moments more than she cared to admit. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Ben, too, found comfort in Sarah's presence. She was warm, intelligent, and easy to talk to. She never judged him, even when he admitted the mistakes he had made in his life. Being around her was different. It wasn't just about physical attraction. It was the way she made him feel safe and understood. He didn't plan on feeling that way. He certainly didn't expect it to become something more. But the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the connection growing between them. John remained unaware. Caught up in court cases and deadlines, he missed the subtle changes, the stolen glances, the quiet tension. He trusted them both completely, never once suspecting. that anything inappropriate was happening under his own roof. And why would he? It was his wife and his brother. To him, they were family, and family meant loyalty. But loyalty has its limits. Slowly, lines began to blur. What began as emotional comfort started to shift into something riskier, something dangerous. Neither Ben nor Sarah said anything out loud, but the silence between them began to speak louder than words. What they were feeling couldn't stay hidden forever. As the weeks passed, the bond between Sarah and Ben deepened. What had begun as casual conversation and friendly companionship slowly turned into something charged, something neither of them could deny. The first time it crossed the line was unplanned, a moment of weakness sparked by weeks of tension, lingering looks, and too much wine. It was quick, impulsive, and immediately followed by guilt. But instead of ending things, they found themselves drawn to each other even more. They didn't speak about it the next day. The air was thick with silence, but not regret. They avoided being alone for a few days, each trying to convince themselves that it was a one-time mistake. Yet beneath the surface, they both knew it wasn't over. The pull between them had only grown stronger, and the secrecy gave it an added thrill. Soon, what started as a single act became a dangerous pattern. Late-night rendezvous, hushed footsteps, carefully timed moments when the house was quiet and no one was watching. Each encounter pushed them deeper into something they could no longer control. Sarah justified it in her mind as filling a void. She told herself that John had drifted away emotionally and that Ben had simply been there when she needed someone. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about loneliness. It was about desire, validation, and a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. For Ben, it was more complicated. He had always lived on the edge, never fully grounded. But this was different. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Not just morally, but within his own family. Every time he looked at his brother, he felt a knot in his stomach, yet it never stopped him from returning to Sarah. They took risks. Sometimes they were almost reckless, barely escaping being caught. A door left slightly open, a shirt left in the wrong room, a glance held too long at dinner. They convinced themselves they were being careful, but the cracks were starting to show. The tension between them became harder to hide, even as they tried to maintain normalcy in front of John and the children. What they didn't realize was that their secret was already beginning to unravel, not because someone had seen them, but because consequences were already set in motion. A slow, silent danger had entered their lives, and it would change everything. Had never been one to worry much about his health. He'd lived his life by instinct, spur-of-the-moment choices, late nights, and never much thought about tomorrow. So when he first started feeling off, he brushed it aside. At first, it was just a general tiredness. He blamed it on stress, poor sleep, maybe even the emotional weight of his affair with Sarah. But the fatigue lingered, and then came the night sweats, the headaches, and a nagging cough that wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right, and it was getting harder to ignore. A couple of weeks later, Ben woke up with swollen glands and a fever that wouldn't break. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Sunken eyes, pale skin, a shadow of the confident man he had once been. For the first time in a long while, he felt scared. He finally made an appointment with a doctor, expecting maybe a severe flu or a lingering infection. The physician ordered blood tests and asked routine questions, but one in particular made Ben freeze. "Have you been sexually active recently?" He hesitated before giving a vague answer, not ready to share the truth. Not about Sarah, not about anything. When the test results came back, the news was worse than he could have imagined. Ben had tested positive for HIV. The diagnosis hit him like a truck. He sat in stunned silence as the doctor explained the next steps: further testing, starting treatment, contacting any recent partners. But Ben wasn't listening. His mind was spinning. How could this have happened? He hadn't been with anyone since his last girlfriend, and they had broken up months ago. Except there was Sarah. The realization struck him with brutal force. There had been no one else. The timeline matched. The only person he had been with was his brother's wife. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. denial, anger, fear. Could Sarah have known? Had she infected him knowingly? Or had she been unaware all along? The idea that this wasn't just a mistake, but something far more dangerous began to settle in. Suddenly, the affair was no longer just a betrayal of trust. It had become something far more serious. Ben left the clinic that day a different man, broken, frightened, and with a growing suspicion that the consequences of what they'd done had only just begun. Ben couldn't sleep after receiving the diagnosis. He lay awake for nights, staring at the ceiling, reliving every decision that had led him to this moment. The news had shaken him to his core, but what haunted him more than the illness itself was the question of how it happened. He kept circling back to the same terrifying conclusion. Sarah was the only person he had been with. He hadn't even considered HIV as a possibility, not with her. She was married, a mother, someone who seemed safe. But now, everything he thought he knew had been flipped upside down. As the reality of his diagnosis began to sink in, Ben started to revisit moments he'd previously ignored. A time when Sarah had seemed unusually anxious, an odd comment she made about not feeling well, a prescription bottle in the bathroom cabinet with a name he didn't recognize. At the time, none of it had meant anything. Now, every small detail felt like a piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. He became obsessed with figuring out the truth. He couldn't confront her, not yet, but he began watching her more closely, noting her routines, the way she acted around John, the way she avoided certain conversations. Paranoia crept in, feeding off his fear and guilt. He began searching her drawers, her bags, anything that might offer answers. What he found was worse than he expected: a medical folder tucked deep in her closet, containing lab results dated months before the affair began. It confirmed what he feared. Sarah had been diagnosed as HIV positive long before they had ever crossed a line. His hands trembled as he read the document. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was deception with consequences. He sat on the floor of her closet for hours, numb and unable to move, trying to make sense of why she never told him. Had she convinced herself that she couldn't pass it on? Did she hope he would never find out? Or had she simply not cared enough to protect him? Ben felt a wave of emotions crashing over him: rage, heartbreak, confusion. He was sick, and now he knew it wasn't by chance. It had been preventable. And the person responsible was not just someone he had trusted, but someone he had loved. The secret they had kept was now a time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. Ben couldn't carry the weight of the truth any longer. The guilt, the fear, the betrayal. It had grown too heavy to bear alone. He had spent days rehearsing what he would say to John, going over every possible reaction, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment it actually happened. One evening, as John returned home late from work, tired and unsuspecting, Ben broke. The words came out like a flood, halting, disjointed, but raw. He confessed everything: the affair with Sarah, how long it had been going on, and finally, the most devastating part: his HIV diagnosis and the evidence that Sarah had known she was positive all along. John didn't say a word. He just stared at his brother, stunned and motionless, as though trying to process a language he didn't understand. His world had tilted on its axis: the wife he had built a life with, the brother he had trusted like no other. Both had betrayed him in the worst ways imaginable. It wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just lies. It was a betrayal that carried life-altering consequences. He had invited Ben into his home out of kindness, and now that kindness had blown his family apart. Ben watched helplessly as his brother's face turned from shock to pain, and finally to fury. But there was no yelling, no violence, just a silence, so heavy it felt louder than any scream. That silence said more than words ever could. John walked away without saying a thing, locking himself in the bedroom where Sarah was already asleep, unaware that her secret was now out in the open. The confrontation with Sarah came the next morning. There were no denials, just a broken, tearful admission. She said she had been afraid, ashamed, and unsure of how to tell anyone. She had convinced herself she wasn't a risk, that it wouldn't happen, that the affair would stay hidden forever. But those excuses only deepened the wound. Her silence had cost Ben his health and John his family. There was no repairing what had been done. The house that once buzzed with warmth and routine now felt cold and hollow. Trust had evaporated overnight, replaced by a sense of betrayal so deep it seemed permanent. The affair was no longer just a secret. It had become a devastating truth that none of them could escape. Held the family together unraveled almost overnight. John moved out of the bedroom and began sleeping on the living room couch, unable to even look at Sarah without feeling sick. The children, too young to understand what was happening, sensed the tension. Their once happy home had grown silent and strained. Meals became brief and awkward. Doors closed more often. Smiles disappeared. Sarah tried to hold things together, but the damage was done. Her attempts to explain her choices fell flat. No reason she gave could make up for the fact that she had knowingly hidden a serious medical condition, had betrayed her husband, and exposed his brother to irreversible harm. Every apology only deepened John's anger. Her tears no longer moved him. In his eyes, the woman he had married was gone, replaced by someone he no longer recognized. Ben, consumed by guilt and despair, packed up his things and left the house within days. He couldn't bear to stay any longer. The home that had once been a refuge now felt toxic. He had destroyed his relationship with John, betrayed his trust in the worst possible way, and now faced a lifetime of managing a disease that could have been prevented. He moved into a small apartment across town, alone and isolated, trying to navigate a new life defined by shame and consequences. John, meanwhile, began the painful process of separating from Sarah. Divorce papers were drafted quietly, without any dramatic confrontations. He told himself it was for the best, for him, for the kids, for any hope of moving on. But it didn't make the loss any easier. At night, he lay awake haunted by the memories, family trips, holidays, quiet mornings, all now tainted by betrayal. Sarah remained in the family home with the children, though the walls that once held laughter now echoed with silence. She had destroyed the very thing she thought she was protecting. The affair had been a momentary escape, but the price she paid was her marriage, her stability, and the respect of the people closest to her. What once was a solid, loving family had been reduced to broken pieces. And the worst part was it hadn't come from outside. It had come from within. The damage wasn't just emotional, it was permanent, and it had changed their lives forever. In the weeks that followed the collapse of the Harris family, the consequences of Sarah's actions continued to spiral. Ben, now living alone and trying to manage his diagnosis, began attending medical appointments and learning how to live with HIV. The process was overwhelming. Every visit to the clinic served as a reminder of what he had lost and how deeply he had been betrayed. The physical toll was only part of it. The emotional strain was far worse. He avoided calls from friends, ignored texts from Sarah, and refused to see John, knowing their relationship might be beyond repair. But as time passed, another painful thought began to take root. Should Sarah be held legally responsible? Ben had discovered through her medical records that she had known about her status months before the affair started. She had made the choice to stay silent, despite knowing the risk. It wasn't just morally wrong, it could be criminal. After several late-night internet searches and a hesitant conversation with his doctor, Ben learned that knowingly exposing someone to HIV without disclosure could be grounds for legal action in their state. The idea of going to court filled him with dread. Taking legal action against Sarah would mean reliving everything publicly. It would drag their private disaster into a courtroom, with strangers picking through their shame. But it would also be a stand against the silence that had changed his life forever. Ben consulted with an attorney who confirmed that he had a case. The facts were there: proof of Sarah's prior diagnosis, proof of their relationship, and now, medical documentation of his own positive status. Meanwhile, Sarah was beginning to feel the pressure too. Though John had moved out and refused to speak to her beyond the logistics of co-parenting, she had heard whispers. People in their community were beginning to ask questions. Friends were keeping their distance. And when Sarah received a formal, Notice of legal intent from Ben's attorney. Her world narrowed even further. What she had tried to hide was now on the verge of becoming a matter of public record. The case wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability. It was about the consequences of silence, the damage of deception, and the irreversible effects of one person's decision to hide the truth. What had started as a secret affair had now turned into a legal storm, and no one involved would come out of it unchanged. The Harris family had once been a symbol of stability, admired by friends, neighbors, and relatives, but now their name carried a different weight, one whispered in hushed tones at community events and avoided in conversations altogether. The fallout from the affair and the legal action that followed had fractured more than just the immediate relationships. It had created ripples that spread into every part of their lives, leaving behind confusion, anger, and irreversible damage. John had become a shadow of the man he once was. Once proud and confident, he now moved through life with quiet detachment. He focused on his work with renewed intensity, using long hours at the office to avoid thinking about what waited for him when he returned home to his temporary apartment. His children visited on weekends, and though he tried to keep things normal for them, there was a sadness in his eyes they couldn't quite understand. He avoided talking about Sarah or Ben, but the silence around their names spoke volumes. The betrayal had cut so deeply that forgiveness felt impossible. Sarah, on the other hand, had become isolated. Her social circle had disappeared almost overnight. Friends who once leaned on her for advice or invited. The lawsuit had made her situation public, and even though no official charges had been filed yet, the damage to her reputation was already done. At school drop-offs and grocery store lines, she felt the stares. She tried to keep her head down, to focus on the children, but the weight of her choices followed her everywhere. Ben lived in a different kind of isolation. Physically, he was managing his illness well with treatment, but emotionally, he remained trapped. His relationship with John was beyond repair. The guilt consumed him daily, and while he still believed Sarah should be held accountable for her silence, it didn't erase the part he played in everything. He avoided public places, knowing that the story had spread. His name was no longer just associated with bad luck or failed jobs. It was now part of a scandal that had torn a family apart. The bonds that once held them together were shattered. Where there had once been family dinners and shared memories, there was now silence and distance. No one reached out. No one made amends. The damage wasn't just emotional. It was a permanent divide that none of them knew how to cross. Just when it seemed the story had reached its lowest point, a final and devastating truth surfaced, one that none of them had seen coming. During the legal proceedings, Sarah's medical records were subpoenaed as part of the case. Ben's lawyer wanted definitive proof of when she had been diagnosed with HIV. What they uncovered, however, revealed something far more troubling. Sarah hadn't simply known about her condition shortly before the affair began. She had been diagnosed nearly a year earlier. The documents showed test results, treatment plans, and notes from a specialist advising her on managing the virus and the importance of informing partners. There was even evidence that she had picked up medication, though she hadn't taken it regularly. It became clear that Sarah had not only known her status well in advance, but had also chosen not to follow medical advice or disclose her condition to anyone. Not to her husband, and certainly not to Ben. This revelation shattered any remaining illusions. The affair had been reckless, the betrayal cruel. But this was something else. It was deliberate silence, a calculated risk. Sarah had knowingly exposed Ben to a life-altering virus, and in doing so, had crossed a line that went far beyond infidelity or poor judgment. The discovery hardened Ben's resolve. Any lingering doubt he had about pursuing legal action vanished. He deserved justice, not out of revenge, but because no one should have to suffer what he did without choice. John, too, felt the final blow of this truth. For a moment, he had allowed himself to wonder if there could be healing, at least for the sake of the children. But knowing Sarah had carried this secret for so long, even as she kissed him goodnight and sat across the table from him every day, made that impossible. The legal case moved forward, but it was no longer about just what had happened. It was about everything that could have been prevented. It was about trust, broken so thoroughly it could never be rebuilt. The final truth didn't just confirm their worst fears, it redefined them. In the end, what remained wasn't just the story of an affair. It was the story of choices made in the dark, consequences that spread like wildfire, and a family that would never be whole again. The real tragedy was not just what had been lost, but how easily it could have been avoided.